Welcome to week 18 of the Objectivism book study. I'm Cody Leibold. We're discussing the first half of chapter 6 of Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand by Leonard Peikoff, pages 187 to 197. The reading this week introduces the need for a philosophical inquiry into the nature of man. Leonard Peikoff notes that this inquiry comes before a theory of ethics. Before knowing what is right for man to do, we should establish what man is. In agreement with Aristotle, Ayn Rand understood man as the rational animal, or instead of animal, creature, if you like. It is man's ability to be rational that makes him unique from the other creatures. This week's reading explores the idea of living organisms being goal-directed and conditional. Conditional means they are capable of either living or dying. This distinct quality of living beings has broad implications for understanding the nature of such entities. With this point, the book is addressing the creaturely aspect of man and getting ready to connect that with what is specific to man, his rational mind. Objectivism conceives of man as the long-range conceptual being. Man is able to plan his life over a period of decades. He's able to hold a vision of what he wants to accomplish, to preserve and to expand the range of his actions that form his whole life. He does this by means of concepts and by rationality. And so reason is man's basic means of survival. When Rand says it is the basic means of survival, she is saying reason is that which other things depend on, the most other things. Perhaps every part of man's survival, or almost every part of man's survival, depends on him using reason. It's his most important tool. You could compare it to the tool of the dog's instincts or sense of smell, or strength, or speed, or teeth. But for man, it's the mind. It's his means of survival. In the reading this week, Peikoff shows how man's animality and his rationality connect. Man's distinct way of life is to use his mind, to use concepts, in every part of his effort to survive and to thrive over the full range of his time of his life on Earth. This thriving depends on man not only possessing reason and using it, but also even being self-aware about reason. Man must be self-aware about the importance of reason in his own life in order to make the best of his life. So while it is true that historically the role of the mind has been misunderstood, the role of the mind in life has been diminished. Ayn Rand herself has made an important contribution to mankind's survival by her philosophical work, and especially by writing Atlas Shrugged. Work of fiction, it's a novel. It's her greatest work. It explores as its theme the role of the mind in human life. And so having read Atlas Shrugged, you will have a concretized understanding of what happens if the mind were to be derogated to a great degree throughout society. And even if the best minds in society were to go on strike and simply stop trying to succeed by normal worldly standards of success for a period of time. When the mind goes on strike, what happens? Ayn Rand shows that step by step when you remove the mind like a scientific experiment before and after. So Ayn Rand maps out the consequences of taking the mind out of human life, the consequences to normal, virtuous, honest people, the consequences to those who have wickedly tried to live off of other people, which she refers to as the looters with their guns, and the moochers with their baseless appeals to pity and need. And so that's a major theme in Atlas Shrugged, is what happens to all those people when the most rational, the most talented and capable people go on strike, and it's a strike of the mind. So this is a major theme in Atlas Shrugged because the overall theme is the role of the mind in human life. A major sub-theme is this idea of the mind-body integration. There is no way to attain success in regard to the things of the mind unless that success is given some suitable form in reality physically. Also, there is no way to attain meaningful success in regard to the physical, to the things of the body, unless the rational mind is engaged in the activity. These two things must come together. That is the concept of mind-body integration. It's the principle. So man is an integrated being of body and mind. And if he is to live, he must live as his dual nature demands. And there is no necessary conflict between these two aspects of his nature, his body and his mind. So this principle, this mind-body integration principle, parallels an earlier idea that we've been exploring, which is the idea that objectivity in thinking requires respecting the role of both external reality and human reason. Reality and reason, as Leonard Peikoff likes to say. So recall that subjectivism, and by this I mean the subjectivist theory of concepts, or subjectivism as an epistemology more generally, Subjectivism upholds the role of the mind, but it excludes the role of reality. Things are what I want them to be, because I say so, or what society wants them to be, because society says so. And then recall the other side of the coin was intrinsicism. Now this is Ayn Rand's term for theories that uphold the role of reality, but that exclude the role of the mind. It is on the basis of the objectivist theory of concepts and epistemology that Leonard Peikoff is now able to explain the principle of the mind-body integration. So he's going to combat both the intrinsicist and subjectivist schools, and he's going to take an approach which we would refer to as the objectivist theory of mind and body. The context for this topic is going to include much of what we've previously discussed. It's going to include the topics of the relationship of consciousness and existence, all the way back from the chapter on metaphysics. It's going to include the topic of what is the nature of consciousness. Consciousness is conceptual, as we've been discussing for weeks. Consciousness is volitional. That was a metaphysical point we made. It's also going to include topics about reason versus emotion. These are the topics we've been discussing more recently. Objectivism has a theory on the right relationship between reason and emotion. All of that is the foundation for what we're going to discuss now when we get to the topic of a philosophical inquiry into the nature of man. Another word for that would be anthropology, a study of man's nature. So with that as an introduction, let's see what a philosophical inquiry into the nature of man includes, according to objectivism. And we'll add our own comments that come from a Christian perspective. We're not going to strongly disagree with most of the material in this reading, but we're going to add to it because as Christians, we have a lot more to say about anthropology, about man's nature, and about man's role in the universe, because we have a different metaphysics. So let's begin our reading on page 187. The question that we are asking in this reading is, what is man? What kind of being is he? What are his essential attributes? That's the issue. At the bottom of that page, Peikoff summarizes, Ayn Rand looked at men and saw the possibility of Howard Rourke and John Galt. So you're not going to understand anything about objectivism's anthropology or inquiry into man unless you've read The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged. That would be the basic material that you're going to have to understand, because Ayn Rand has given a vision of what she thinks man is. Now, does that mean that she thinks all men are that way, that all men are heroes? Absolutely not. Most of the characters that Ayn Rand creates are mixed in quality. But she envisions man as being capable of becoming heroic, capable of being rational. Rationality is in his nature. That doesn't mean that he's always rational. It means that it's something that is a possibility. Peikoff writes, a philosophical inquiry into man is not part of the special sciences, such as psychology, history, or economics. It does not define detailed laws of human thought, feeling, or action. It is concerned only with fundamentals. So he limits the scope of what he's going to say on this topic quite a bit. It's just what are the preconditions of going into a discussion of what's right and wrong for man and ethics. See, we're not yet discovering what is right and wrong as far as his code of values or his code of conduct. What we're looking at is a step to that. He says, in this inquiry, one is not concerned to discover what is right for man or wrong, desirable or undesirable, good or evil. A view of man is a step on the road to ethics, but the view itself does not include value judgments. The concern here is a purely factual question. What is the essence of human nature? The essence of human nature. It's a factual question. When we go to make value statements, they have to be made on the basis of factual identifications. So he writes, like the special sciences, value judgments, ethical, political, and aesthetic, presuppose an answer to this question. What are you? We have to know what a human being is. And Peikoff, this is all material that is positioning this inquiry within our overall structure of knowledge. Peikoff points out that this question does not rightly come up until you already have established something about metaphysics and something about epistemology. It wouldn't be appropriate to make comments about ethics until you have some material on those other issues. This is different from the way most philosophers approach things, beginning midstream. So if you were to imagine the structure of philosophy as a whole, there is metaphysics and epistemology, and then after that there's the theory of man. Hierarchically, the theory of man is dependent on those two subjects, and then ethics and its applied aspects, including political theory and aesthetics, all that branches out from the theory of man. A view of man is not a primary. It rests on metaphysics and epistemology. And then he writes, that we're going to rely on those other points about the relationship of consciousness and existence. It relies on the understanding of consciousness as volitional and as conceptual. It relies on the understanding of a right relationship between reason and emotions. The points that objectivism is going to make about man and man's nature do not follow deductively from all of those points. You can't just deduce the next stage in your philosophy. That's not what objectivism teaches. Rather, we bring in new observations. And so now it's time to look scientifically for a moment about what man is. So on top of page 189, the theme here is living organisms as goal-directed and conditional. Peikoff writes, the most fundamental difference among the entities we perceive is that between the animate and the inanimate. He writes, man is a certain kind of living organism. And so we have to ask ourselves, what is the distinctive mode of action of this living organism as opposed to, say, the dog or the tree? Peikoff writes that the actions of a living organism are self-generated and goal-directed. They are actions initiated by the organism for the sake of achieving an end. If you have read Atlas Shrugged, this is part of one of the main speeches, and so you'll recognize these concepts. In the middle of 189, Peikoff writes, a plant, an animal, or a man is a complex, delicate, self-regulating integration of components. He points out living action is goal-directed action. He points out that if you were to invade a desk, say with a knife cut, nothing happens but the cut. But if we invade an animal's body with a cut or a harmful germ, it instantly mobilizes its resources to fight off the attack, counteract any ill effects, heal its wounds. Inanimate matter pursues no goals. It is indifferent to consequences. A living entity is not indifferent. This is the key distinction. It's key to identifying what it means to be a living being, is that it's something that's in a process of action, and that action is capable of being stopped if it were to die or be damaged. Top of 190 talks about some of the functions of living beings. The functions, well, they're all directed to a single goal, and the goal is the maintenance of the organism's life. So what does the nature of a living being require? It requires that within the limits of its capacities, Peikoff writes, it acts to sustain itself. That doesn't mean that it will always succeed. Some trees die, depending on if it's not enough water or too much sun, too hot. Plants can die. Within the limits of their own capacities, all living beings naturally will do that which is required for it to sustain its processes and then to reproduce itself. So he would say that their actions are goal-directed. And when he says goal-directed, he points out this is not synonymous with having a purpose. It's a related idea, but goal-directed means that the actions are such that they result in the living being sustaining itself. It doesn't mean that the living being has a mind necessarily. Plants don't. Animals don't have a conceptual consciousness necessarily. So he writes, goal-directed, and this is quoting Ayn Rand, designates the fact that the automatic functions of living organisms are actions whose nature is such that they result in the preservation of the organism's life. And he writes, living organisms can and must act to pursue goals because an organism, unlike an inanimate object, faces an alternative of life or death. You can see the relationship to Galt's speech. John Galt writes that matter is indestructible, it changes its forms, but it cannot cease to exist. It is only a living organism that faces a constant alternative, the issue of life or death. So this is basic. You would think everybody knows this. This is the kind of thing that you learn in grade school. But how much do you see the pastors, the theologians, the philosophers attempting to connect this grade school level of insight to what they will say about what man is? So Ayn Rand points out that life is motion. It's a definite course of motion. If the motion is defaulted on or if it fails, what ensues is the antithesis of life, stillness, which is the essence of death. Death is the irreversible cessation of vital processes. Christians would have some comments on this, that we don't believe that physical death is the only death. We also think that there's such thing as your spirit, which will end up going to heaven or hell, and that it will last forever. Within the context of life on earth, Christians don't dispute what is being said here, that there is such thing as physical bodies that do die, and that there are consequences to that. Peikoff writes at the bottom of this page, the fact of life of conditional goal-directed entities has profound philosophic significance. It is a key to the nature of man, and as we'll see in the next chapter, a necessary and sufficient condition of the existence of values. So that's a quite a claim. He thinks that the fact that living beings can die is a necessary and sufficient condition of the existence of values. That's something that we'll have to discuss more as we get there. It's not something that we can go into at the moment, but we may have some qualifications. We may have some disagreements with the way they conceive of where values come from, what they are, what facts of reality give rise to them. Top of 192, materialist today, and he says they're dedicated to monism. Materialism, the idea that everything is just the physical matter, the chemicals. If you've read Atlas Shrugged, then you know there's a character that is called the nursemaid, or Tony, and that he has been taught by his professors that we are just chemicals and that nothing really matters, and therefore that there's no such thing as an absolute right and wrong, and there are no absolutes. And so Henry Reardon refers to him as non-absolute, jokingly, but over the course of the story, they form a personal connection, and actually this non-absolute Tony becomes an absolute. He learns what it means to be an absolute, and it's one of the most moving episodes in the whole novel. But the materialists don't believe that. They believe in monism. They believe that everything reduces only to stuff, to the chemicals. And so they believe that organisms are mere appearance. You can see from that, it could be argued that it doesn't matter if you have to kill 1 million organisms in order to achieve some end, because ends are just chemicals. They don't believe that there is meaning in the ultimate sense. I'll read you this paragraph. I think it's quite important. Whatever the ultimate explanation of biological phenomena, whether life derives from some as yet unknown but non-mystical element combining with matter, as we now understand it, or from some special combination of known material ingredients, in either case it will not alter the existence or the identity of a living organism. So the objectivists are, I would say that they're agnostic. They're agnostic about the question of how we resolve the debate over materialism versus dualism. The materialists are the monists, but objectivists seem to be okay with dualism, at least in theory. They don't have a strong theory about where souls come from, or whether they just arise from the substrata of material, or whether they exist in some other realm. But what they do know is that there is consciousness, and that there is material. They don't have a strong theory about how to account for that. If you're familiar with the philosophy of Descartes, you'll know Descartes referred to this mind-body problem, and he had kind of a strange physiological theory for how the mind connects to the body. He was aware of this. He called it the mind-body problem, and I just want to make a point that the mind-body problem that's the question of how these two things relate. That's not exactly the same thing as the mind-body dichotomy that we had discussed in the introduction. They're both about the mind and the body, but the mind-body problem is this question of, are we just material, or are we something else? That's what we're discussing here. Jacob, I saw you had your hand raised.
Yeah, I was just going to say that while it's true that, especially right here, Peikoff is expressing a sort of agnostic view on the nature of the soul, or the nature of our rational capacity as human beings. And they say it doesn't matter what the explanation is, it won't negate the fact that we do have this rational capacity. I think that's true, but it's also true that because of the nature of the fact that we do have this rational capacity, it rules out certain options. So I think they are being arbitrarily agnostic, or they're being too agnostic, because they aren't, I don't think, willing to draw the conclusions of, okay, because of the nature of the thing that we're talking about, this rational capacity that we're talking about, because it has the nature that it has, the cause of it, the underlying cause of it, can't be XYZ. They don't want to draw that line. And I think it's important that we press them on that. The XYZ that I'm referring to there is going to be the kind of materialism that I think they want to try to hold on to in opposing the Christian worldview.
So there's part of what they're saying that is correct that we need to press them on. We need to press them to accept the implications of it. Peikoff goes on and he says, just as an explanation of consciousness, should such be forthcoming, would not alter its existence or identity. He says, an explanation does not erase the reality it explains. This is a very pregnant point in objectivism. An explanation of something does not erase the reality of it. And you can apply that in several different topics. We're not going to say that there's no such thing as love because when a man looks at his wife, there are certain chemicals in his brain. It just doesn't follow. Just because you can say that that is part of the explanation of it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Likewise, if you're trying to, like I've seen a discussion lately about John Piper's perspective on faith and salvation and the affections. He has a book about it. The ability to explain faith does not reduce it in such a way that it becomes not faith. If you could explain that faith requires affections, that doesn't necessarily prove that faith is works. It doesn't explain it away. It just explains what it is. And we have to be willing to think with distinctions like that. So bottom of 192. No one will ever show that a man being shot and the bullet piercing his body are metaphysically interchangeable entities, since they are, quote, merely collections of atoms in motion. And then he writes, one collection can die and the other cannot. And here I'm thinking about scenes in Atlas Shrugged, and I'm thinking about how much of Atlas Shrugged is premised on this idea. There is a difference between living things and non-living things. If you think about one of the very first speeches in Atlas Shrugged, the one by Francisco, where they're looking out at the empty plains with a storm, and they're inside a nice house that belongs to Henry Reardon. Francisco points out to Henry, how many of the people that are in this room right now understand that you've provided shelter from that storm, and that had you and others like you not provided wealth and created and produced, then we would all live as animals on the plain, and how many of us would even still be alive if that were the case? And so this is Atlas Shrugged's theme, is the role of the mind in production. And it's underappreciated. If you want to see the extent that our society underappreciates the role of the mind, the necessity to apply the mind to the tangible and physical in order to make life possible, definitely read Atlas Shrugged, because it's going to show you, and after you read it, you'll begin to see this isn't just fiction. This is the way other people talk about it too. This is the way the New York Times talks about production and the role of the mind. This is the way the Atlantic talks about it. This is the way Christians and seminarians talk about it. Unfortunately, there's just a lack of appreciation for this point. Jennifer, I saw you raise your hand.
Yeah, I just wanted to interject with a snippet of Galt's speech that sort of emphasizes what you're talking about, which, is exactly what this chapter is about, that man's mind is his basic tool of survival, and his body is given, our body is given to us, but to sustain it through food and action is up to us. And we have our mind, but the content of our mind is not given to us. We have to use our mind to acquire our sustenance. Part of the speech, he says, without a knowledge of his aim, which is the goal-oriented, and then the means to achieve it, is what we need to remain alive, and that we must think. And that part of that speech where he's like, you must think. And I more widely attribute that just not to, I need food. How am I going to get food? How am I going to prepare food? How do I make sure which food is not poisonous? It's not just that. It's like every part of survival is dependent on our thinking capacity. And I'm really looking forward to when these concepts get into our ethics and our values. So that's all I'm going to say for now.
Thank you for that. We're at the top of 193, and so I would say that the point has been adequately established. Living organisms are goal-directed, and living organisms are conditional. That is the context in which we move to the next point, which is reason as man's basic means of survival. So Peikoff writes, every living organism has a means of survival. Plants survive by means of purely physical functions. For every form of life above this level, however, consciousness is the basic means of survival. So a dog, a cat, a horse, these things use consciousness. They use consciousness in a way that plants don't have minds or brains. Maybe brains is the more technical term to use here. Dogs, cats, horses have brains, and they're the main tool for surviving. He points out that the lower conscious species, perhaps like jellyfish, flatworms, they appear to have only the faculty of sensation. Something touches them, they respond sort of like a machine would, but there's no processing of that information other than just what is necessary to immediately respond. The higher level animals, they grasp and deal with the world of entities. Your dog knows that you're a person, and he knows that you're a different person than someone else. Peikoff writes, man too experiences the sensations of pleasure and pain, but he is a conceptual being. So we have this other layer, not just the sensation, not just the perception. We also have the conceptual layer, which we've discussed many times before. And concepts and their products are not automatic. They're not infallible. So therefore, we have this need, since we are the conceptual beings, we have this need for rationality. Unlike dogs, which don't have to sit there and think about whether they're right or wrong about anything, we do, because we're more complex. We have that capacity, and therefore we have that need. So 194, Peikoff writes, man cannot function or survive by the guidance of mere sensations or percepts. He identifies what his goal is and how to achieve it. Here's a quote from Ayn Rand. She writes that a man needs a process of thought to discover how to plant and to grow his food, how to make weapons for hunting, how to build the simplest shelter. Man does not survive by adjusting himself to the given. So whereas most other species live where they're capable of living, say grass sends out seeds, and whichever seeds can grow in whatever area do grow, and whichever can't die. We don't survive that way. We don't survive like the bugs that have thousands and thousands of eggs. Rather, we train up our young for years, even decades we train them, in order to know how they can survive as conceptual beings. And we don't just put them out in a field and see which ones survive and which ones don't. Rather, we construct for ourselves habitats in which we can survive at the best, in which we can have the widest range of actions available to us, the longest amount of life available, and the healthiest life. Rand and Peikoff, they're pointing out here that bread, shirts, apartments, hammers, matches, light bulbs, and penicillin do not grow like weeds or wild berries, waiting for man to seize them. The goods we need, paraphrasing a line from Atlas Shrugged, are not here. They must be created by human action. They must be produced. It's a good method philosophically when you're trying to figure out an idea like this, not simply to say man needs production, which is an abstraction, but man needs penicillin, man needs hammers, apartments, shirts, matches, light bulbs. Concretize all the things, because you will then realize that you cannot turn your head one direction or the next without seeing cause and effect, without seeing the cause of man's survival, and realizing that the cause of man's survival is man's mind at work. Jacob, I saw you raise your hand.
I wanted to draw attention once again, as we have a couple times throughout this series, to the difference between how we and how objectivists answer the question, what is man, and how many Christians answer the question, right? So the predominant way that many Christians today would answer that question is simply say, the image of God. And then if you ask them to unpack that, all they would have to say about it would be things related strictly to soteriology. Like, what does it mean? Well, it means that after the fall, we are fallen and in need of Christ's righteousness and God's grace, and we need to glorify God in everything we do. And that's about all the content that they would be able to ascribe to the nature of man. And they would reflexively cringe at the idea that rationality is somehow essential to man's nature or worthy of talking about the way that we're talking about it. It's impossible to not see a connection between that mindset and the Gnosticism, the practical Gnosticism that we see in Christian culture all the time, that separates out physical, rational work and livelihood as unholy or unspiritual, and then worship on Sunday morning as the spiritual thing. We see that kind of Gnosticism all the time, and we bemoan it. And most Christians, at least today, do bemoan that type of Gnosticism, but they won't challenge the underlying premise about the nature of man and draw the connections. And that's what we're trying to do here.
That's an outstanding point. I remember when I was in seminary talking to a friend of mine about what is the imago Dei, the image of God. And I said, I think that it is rationality, because if we make observations about what distinguishes men from animals, we're the rational animal. I think Aristotle was right about that follows from observation. And his perspective was, no, we can't just do that. That's jumping to conclusions. And he wanted to argue that instead Maybe it was our capacity to love other people, or that it's our capacity to exist socially. And so, because God is a Trinity. And so then therefore man's ability to, for example, marry or start a family, those are the qualities. And I'm thinking, are you trying to differentiate men from animals? Because animals also are capable of monogamy and creating families. And animals are capable of affection. So where do we distinguish ourselves from animals? Why are you unwilling to look at reality when you try to do that? But I mean, the approach that this friend of mine had was, the Bible says that we are in the image of God, and it doesn't tell us specifically how. So we're just going to take it from the Bible that we are.
The other thing that he's doing there is he is having a rabid allergic reaction to individualism, to the individualism implied by saying that rationality is essential to man's nature. He wants to have some form of collectivism be the answer rather than anything that might imply individualism. He wants relational, that which relates man to other men has to be essential to man's nature. It can't be something that is inherent to the individual apart from other men. So he's sort of having an allergic reaction to like I said, the implicit individualism there. And I think that's important to point out, because that also shows why we need to be emphasizing individualism as a good thing to the kind of philosophy and the kind of worldview that we're wanting to advocate. Because if you don't have it, then you are going to revert to a sort of collectivism, an irrational collectivism, and it's going to lead to the kind of Gnosticism that we're talking about.
There's a line in The Fountainhead where the villain, Ellsworth Monkton Toohey, is saying to somebody in his preachy, velvety voice, he's saying that the most important thing in the world, in the universe, is people. And the most important aspect of people is their relationships. Because he doesn't see people as individuals. He sees people as collectives and their relationships. And he's a socialist, and he is also a nihilist, but in a stealthy way. Whenever I think of Ellsworth Toohey, I think of many of the people that I met at Southern Seminary. And I certainly think of Albert Mohler and the overall attitude that is being conveyed by Southern Seminary, at least when I was studying there 10 years ago, probably more so today, this attitude, the Ellsworth Toohey perspective on life. I think actually if everybody that would go to Southern Seminary or everybody working at Southern Seminary would read The Fountainhead, oh man, I think it would drive some of them insane when they realized just exactly how much of a picture was painted of them before they were ever born. Page 195. Epistemology tells us that reason is man's faculty of knowing reality. When conjoined with the observed fact that man is an organism who survives by means of his knowledge and consequent action, the inference must be that reason is man's basic tool of survival. I think this is not too controversial in light of what we've said. In the objectivist view, the proposition that man is the rational animal does not mean that men always follow reason. Many do not. But man is the organism that survives by its use is the issue here. Man is the long-range, conceptual, productive being. That is man. All right, so now we move on to a slightly different topic, and this is only just a few more pages, and then we'll be wrapping up our discussion for today. In comparison to this view of man as a productive being, long-range conceptual being that is able to use rationality to plan out his life and to expand the range of his action and his prosperity. Compare that to what Peikoff describes as the long-standing tradition stretching from Plato to the present, which deprecates the activities involved in human survival as mindless, perceptual level, quote, materialistic, while extolling reason as a, quote, spiritual organ concerned with, quote, pure contemplation. So once again, Southern Seminary, I think, is guilty of that, although to some extent at Southern Seminary they have identified that, and so they had begun to realize that we need to start teaching about faith, work, and economics. And about 10 years back, there was this major push that we needed to start having a theory, a theology of work and a theology of economics. Unfortunately, because of the anti-individualism in their overall worldview, what that meant was a mix between free market principles, supposedly, and statist principles and welfare statism. And I found that most of the professors there would take the position that there should be a safety net. They would take the position that there should be tax incentives for families. These kinds of things that you realize, okay, so you're Republicans that are not really pro-Constitution, you're not really pro-liberty. And all of that, that is the direction that I saw within the seminary at that time. They didn't know how to solve this problem. They didn't know how to solve the problem of the connection between the man's mind and man's flourishing. It's a term that, because it's been discussed by these people so badly and so much. Flourishing is actually something that is biblical and is something that we need to have a good theory on. And we're only going to have that good theory if we come to that question, understanding man as the rational individual, the independent mind. That's the only way. And that has implications on politics too. But this idea of this long-standing tradition stretching from Plato to the present that deprecates the activities of human survival as mindless, it was somewhat understandable if you understand ancient Greece. If you think about the fact that they had a society of aristocrats and slaves, and that the slaves were capable of doing the same thing over and over again, generation after generation, to produce the food and get it to the aristocrats, you could understand that they would think, well, there's nothing more to learn here. And they didn't have the theories that we do, connecting scientific discoveries to productivity. They didn't have the Industrial Revolution like we do. Ayn Rand pointed out that she didn't think that she could have come up with her philosophy if there hadn't already been the Industrial Revolution, because she had to see that this is how the world works. She had to see that the mind put into action leads to inventions, which lead to human productivity and success. And they didn't have as much to work with, as many examples in the time of the ancient Greeks. This was a high barbarian society. The idea of success in this society was you get on a boat, you sail to the opposite end of the sea, and you pillage somebody else's grain and take it back and their gold. And then now you're wealthy. It was a society of pillagers, not to make them all out to be bad guys. But in those days, they didn't necessarily think that looting some other city was morally vicious. If you read the Odyssey and the Iliad and stuff like that, this is just the society that they were in. Sorry to say, they were a society of looters and aristocrats and slaveholders. From their perspective, there wasn't a lot of evidence about the role of the mind. The role of the mind as far as using math or using experiments in order to create inventions, in order to make human life better. Their concept of the role of the mind was, I need to use my mind in order to convince other people to join my army, and use my mind in order to create strategies for winning battles. Who's going to create the weapons? Well, that's a slave's job. That's true in their approach to medicine as well. They used to look down on surgeons. They thought, oh, a surgeon is just a lowly job, whereas they had this separation in their mind between the surgeon who does the physical work versus the doctor who does the intellectual work, the doctor who thinks about what could possibly be the source of diseases in the bowels of the human body, the different theories that they had. And the separation of their theory from practice, it permeated society, and even it permeated society through the Middle Ages as well, to the point where the experts would always point to the theory, but they'd never open their eyes to check whether there was anything in observed reality that aligned with the theory. This whole approach to the relationship between the mind and the body, it caused some of what we would now say are the dark spots in human history, like the Dark Ages. Well, you can see it in Atlas Shrugged. There's different people in Atlas Shrugged that illustrate this principle. One I know is Fred Kinnan. He's the leader of the unions. And Fred Kinnan is just a pragmatist who believes we're all thieves, we're all looters. So I just want to make sure that I can loot as much as I can for my team right now because there's no other way to live. That's his premise. He's one of the most hilarious characters in the story because he's so honest about his own wickedness. So there's the Fred Kinnan type, which is, who cares about ideas? We just need to make sure that we can successfully loot today. Who cares about tomorrow? And then there's Robert Stadler, who's the opposite of Fred Kinnan. Robert Stadler is the scientist, the theoretical physicist, that he thinks, well, who should have to care about where the oil comes from that's going to heat my science institute? What I want is the ability to be left alone from everybody else so that I can theorize, so that I can create something of lasting value for humanity, some higher truths that I can discover, which will shape generations to come. And he has no connection of his ideas to how are they going to be implemented. He doesn't know that his own ideas are being used to create a weapon that's going to be used to threaten society and turn the country into a totalitarian dictatorship. He doesn't care because he's thinking about just the theory, but not the practice. So Stadler is an example of the only theory. Kinnan is an example of the only practice mindset. In ancient Greek thought, they would refer to these as the techne, that's the practice, and the episteme, which is the theory. And they didn't understand the relationship between those two things, at least not the way that we do, not to the extent that we do. But at the bottom of this page 195, Peikoff writes, the Industrial Revolution has blasted this perspective forever. So we sit on the shoulders of giants, those who, thanks to the Industrial Revolution in England and in the United States and other parts of Western Europe, because of the bravery of those who said to the kings, I'm going to start a business and I'm going to succeed. And because of the bravery of those in England who said, there is such thing as the rule of law and the parliament cannot stop us from doing this. The parliament has limits because of the bravery of those who wrote the Magna Carta and the heritage that we have of common law and the protection of individual rights in England. There was the ability of the people in England to create the Industrial Revolution, and then the people in the United States to create the Industrial Revolution. Because of the revolution, now we can look at human history and we can say with certainty, Peikoff writes, on a scale spanning continents, centuries, and every detail of men's daily life, there is a tie between science and wealth, innovation and longevity, knowledge and power, concepts and survival. Peikoff writes, the metaphysical fact about man that underlies these truths is that man is not a battlefield of contending dimensions, spiritual and physical. He is, in Ayn Rand's words, an indivisible entity, an integrated unit of two attributes, matter and consciousness. The mind acquires knowledge and defines goals. The body translates these conclusions into action. How could it be anything other than that, once you think about it? On this page, 196, Peikoff explains the ridiculousness of trying to follow pure thought to the exclusion of action, or pure action to the exclusion of thought. He says that pure thought is non-thought. It is devoid of reference to reality. Pure action is non-action, purposeless movement. Both patterns enacted consistently would mean suicide. Both patterns enacted with consistency is exactly what you see in Atlas Shrugged. I've just read through the whole book. That's what the book is about. A being who is an integration of two attributes cannot function or survive by tearing them apart. A body without a soul is a corpse. A soul without a body is a ghost. That's John Galt's speech. Both a corpse and ghost, she notes, are symbols of death. So, therefore, we arrive at this principle of mind-body integration. It depends for its identification upon a proper philosophic context, as we've seen. You cannot have this clear understanding of the mind-body integration unless you already have some basis for a theory of man's knowledge, right? I mean, because if you didn't have an epistemology, how could you know that man's mind is efficacious? Because we have Ayn Rand's theory of concepts, because we have her theory of how consciousness relates to reality and how emotions relate to reason, because we have all of these things, now we're able to say with confidence that there is a mind-body integration. And this is the nature of man. He is an integrated being of this kind. All right, that's the wrap of that section. The bottom of page 197, Peikoff summarizes, today you can see the prosperity, the safety, the lifespan that America and the entire West enjoys thanks to a cause that everyone has the means to know but few choose to acknowledge. You can also see how men elsewhere endure, suffer, and die in their youth. They die not only in war but in peacetime from starvation and disease. They die this way as the norm, the expected, the accepted throughout the non-industrialized, non-scientific, non-rational rest of the world. Reason is man's tool of survival. From the wheel to the skyscraper. This is from the Fountainhead. Everything we are and everything we have comes from a single attribute of man, the function of his reasoning mind. Now, I will note there are proximate causes, and then there are final causes. Everything that we are and everything that we have comes from God. That would be the final cause. But in the sense of proximate causes, there is nothing around you, if you look around right now, that didn't come from a human mind. Unless you happen to be watching this on your phone standing in the middle of a field, in which case a lot of it came directly from God. But the phone that you're watching this on came from the product of Steve Jobs, most likely. It came from a mind that had the courage to recognize that you must move from theory to practice. And that is what objectivism advocates, bridging between theory and practice. Your theory must be based on what is practicable. Your practice must be based on what is theoretically justifiable. The ends and the means must be suited to each other. That is an integration. That is what we mean when we speak of the mind and the body integration in objectivism. Now, in our next session, next Saturday, we're going to go on to the next part of this chapter, and we'll wrap up this chapter on man and what the objectivists say about the nature of man. We'll get into reason as the attribute of the individual, something we've hinted at here, but we'll expand on that idea. And then we're going to have extra time, because it's a fairly short reading for this coming section. We'll have extra time to discuss the relationship between what Christianity says about man and what Objectivism says about man. Everything that has been said in here, I uphold. And so I will just say that there are some gaps. And the gaps would be, well, we have to understand what we are. We are, after all, creatures. We do, after all, have a creator. That's missing from this account of man. There's nothing been said here so far about man's sin nature. We'll get into that as we get into the ethics. Rand has a theory of what evil is, and it's a correct theory, but it's also a theory with some gaps. With that, I will say thank you for joining us in our recording today. Thank you for applying your mind to the theory so that you can better practice the truth, so that you can better live out your life as a man according to your nature. You can find all of the replays for this at christianintellectual.com/objectivism, and I hope to see you next week. God bless.